Out of the Xperia X line, the Xperia X Performance is the highest end model and is ultimately the biggest flagship that Sony has so far for the year 2016. The design isn't really too surprising at all. It looks very similar to Sony phones we've seen in years past and almost identical to the more mid-range Xperia X, with the only difference being the brushed metal aluminum backing. Otherwise, it's a rectangular slab with glass on the front and tapered edges along the corners and sides that make it pretty comfortable to hold, and because it has a much smaller 5-inch display compared to most other flagships with larger screens, it's really easy to operate in one hand. The overall build does feel very solid and sturdy, but it isn't without its quirks. The brushed metal backing is a nice touch, but similar to the LG G5, it doesn't feel like metal and it feels hollow, as if the internals aren't quite filling up all the space inside. Here, have a listen and you'll see what I mean. My other gripe with this phone are the physical hardware buttons, and this is an area that sounds minor but can really make all the difference in a phone's build quality. Both the volume keys and physical camera shutter button are not clicky and tactile at all, and the mushy feedback makes them feel extremely cheap. The placement of the volume rockers are also not exactly ideal. They're in a very awkward spot right below the power button, making them uncomfortable to press with your thumb, and simple things like taking a screenshot feel a lot more difficult. The position of the volume keys is most likely where it is for the purposes of controlling digital zoom with the camera, but I don't think digital zoom is enough justification to be in such an unergonomic location. Everything else is fine though. The power button is nice and large and easy to press, and then you have your usual headphone jack up top, micro USB port on the bottom, and the SIM card / micro SD card tray on the left side. In typical Sony fashion, the X Performance is IP68 dust and water resistant, so you can dunk it in water, use it in the rain, and it'll be perfectly fine. One feature that it does not have though is a fingerprint sensor, and if this phone came out a couple of years ago where fingerprint sensors weren't as prevalent, that probably would have been okay, but this is 2016 and fingerprint sensors have pretty much become a standard on high-end flagship smartphones, and we're even seeing budget phones that cost a fraction of what the X Performance costs that include fingerprint sensors, so it's a little bit of a head scratcher why Sony chose not to include one. Another oddity with the X Performance is the placement of the NFC chip. So most phones typically have their NFC chips on the back, but the X Performance has its NFC chip on the front in the upper left corner. And the biggest problem with this location is that it makes things like touching your phone to transfer content to somebody else's phone, connecting to a Bluetooth speaker, or using mobile payments a little bit more awkward and cumbersome because you can't see the display. And this is just another one of those quirks that really makes you question why Sony chose to do the things that they did with this phone. So normally you have to go like this, but with the X Performance, you have to go like this. And this is typically where you have to tap the display to finish the beam. I don't think that's gonna fly over too well with most people. Most high-end flagship smartphones these days are packing quad HD displays, but with the X Performance, Sony chose to stick with 1080p, and on a 5-inch screen, 1080p is perfectly fine. It's extremely sharp, colors are vibrant, it gets plenty bright that is easily visible in direct sunlight, and the viewing angles are also quite good. Just like previous Sony devices, you have the option to tweak the white balance and vibrancy of the display to whatever looks best to your eyes. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the display at all. It's a very good looking screen, but this is a $700 smartphone, and pretty much every phone in this price range, if not all, are coming with quad HD displays to the point where it's basically become a standard in high priced flagships. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense why Sony chose to go with 1080p, and it's especially puzzling considering this is the same company that released a 4K smartphone last year. Let that soak in for a minute. On the more positive side, despite certain features being omitted or the questionable hardware decisions, there are some things to like about this phone. First off, it has dual front-facing speakers, which are always awesome to have on any smartphone. They're not the loudest front-facing speakers I've ever heard and could be a notch or two higher in volume, but overall they produce a nice clean sound without any distortion, and they've been a pleasure to use while gaming or watching YouTube. Secondly, Sony did pack the X Performance with flagship specs. You've got the Snapdragon 820 processor, 3GB of RAM, 32 gigs of internal storage, and the micro SD card slot that I mentioned earlier for support up to 200 gigabytes of additional storage. Despite having a gig less of RAM than most other flagships, I haven't noticed any real world differences between the X Performance and other flagships on the market that are rocking the same chipset. It's fast and fluid, touch responsiveness has been great, and it plays games and jumps between multiple applications with very little problems. It's safe to say that performance is not an issue here, and it definitely lives up to that part of its name. Battery life on the X Performance is good, but it isn't anything crazy spectacular. It's got a 2700 mAh battery, which falls short of that magical 3000 mAh mark, but it's good enough to last me a full day as long as I keep that usage to mostly basic tasks like reading emails, texting, web browsing, social media, and maybe an hour or two of watching YouTube. Anything heavier than that, like long gaming sessions coupled with heavy camera usage, and I often found myself having to recharge at least once in the middle of the day. It does have quick charge for faster charging speeds, but despite having a Snapdragon 820, it's utilizing the much older Quick Charge 2.0. If you're really hurting for battery and can't get to a charger, Sony's Stamina and Ultra Stamina modes can effectively stretch your remaining battery life by limiting your phone's functionality. On paper, the Xperia X Performance is packing some impressive sounding cameras. The front camera is a 13 megapixel shooter that packs plenty of detail and resolution. It's more than you really need for video chats and works extremely well if you like taking selfies. On the rear is a 23 megapixel camera with single LED flash, but despite having such a high megapixel count, the X Performance doesn't do 4K video recording, another feature that most flagships have that the X Performance lacks, and instead tops out at 1080p at 60 frames. It does, however, come with a continuous tracking autofocus feature that Sony calls predictive hybrid autofocus, which lets you tap on the screen to lock onto a subject, and it works pretty well provided the subject isn't moving too fast. The camera interface is fairly easy to navigate. Swiping on the display will cycle between Xperia Auto, manual, video, and the usual slew of fun/gimmicky Sony camera features that we've all seen before, like inserting your face into a picture, or the various AR effects that can make dinosaurs crawl all over your living room, or laser beams shoot from your eyes. Having manual controls in the camera app is always a nice feature to have, but Sony's manual mode only gives you the option to tweak white balance and exposure, whereas other smartphone cameras on the market give you a whole lot more. HDR is also only accessible in the settings when shooting in manual, which seems counterintuitive and doesn't make a whole lot of sense since the majority of photos that people take on their smartphones are usually in auto. Picture quality on the X Performance is generally pretty good. In bright lighting conditions, pictures are very well detailed, vibrant, and colorful, but it does tend to make bright colors like pinks and purples look unnatural. It also has a problem with overcrushing shadows, so dynamic range definitely could be better, but HDR can drastically reduce the shadows and bring back a lot of that missing detail. Low light performance isn't terrible and certainly far from the worst, but it isn't anything to really write home about. The camera still produces some perfectly usable photos, but you can easily see the soft details and noise starting to creep in as the lights get dim. Software-wise, you're looking at Android 6.0 Marshmallow with Sony's Xperia UI, and software is definitely one area that Sony has always been pretty good with. It clearly isn't stock Android, but it does maintain a somewhat stock look and feel, and Sony's UI has been updated with a much flatter look, which blends in a lot better with Google's material design. The X Performance comes with the usual Sony apps like LifeLog and PlayStation integration for remotely playing your PlayStation games on your phone, but aside from that, it isn't overly bloated with a bunch of apps that you'll never use. Sony also doesn't bog down the experience with a ton of features either, but there are some pretty useful ones such as double tap to wake, custom icon packs, and a built-in theme engine to customize the look and feel of the interface, although there's only a handful of themes to pick from. The only software tweak that I didn't find particularly useful is the suggested and recommended apps pane, which you can access by swiping down on any home screen or through the app drawer, but thankfully this is a feature that can be disabled. So there's no question that the X Performance is a good phone, despite some of its quirks and odd hardware decisions by Sony. But that's not the problem here. As I mentioned a couple times already, this phone costs $700, putting it in direct competition with the S7, HTC 10, and the LG G5, and the phone's price is the biggest thing working against it. If it's gonna cost $700, it needs to be able to do all the same core things that those phones do, like have a fingerprint sensor, a Quad HD display, and 4K video recording. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have phones like the OnePlus 3 that have a fingerprint sensor and double the RAM of the X Performance while only costing a fraction of the price. Even if this phone were to cost $400 to $500, I'm still not entirely sure it'd be that great of a deal, but for the things that it lacks, it definitely isn't worth $700. If you buy this phone, you will enjoy it, but knowing that there are better deals out there that either cost the same price or a fraction of the price, the X Performance is an investment that isn't going to give you the return that you deserve. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this review of the X Performance, please give it a thumbs up down below and let us know your thoughts on the X Performance in the comments. Is it overpriced? Is it lacking features? Let us know down below, and also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on our future videos. And check us out on social media: Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, Google+, all that good stuff will be linked down below. Follow me on Twitter as well, and check out the website androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. Come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.